Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor.
I hope you can see me well enough. Yes.
Yes.
Um, the what's I think new since we talked last is the increase in the number of apparently terrorist attacks. Although in some cases it's not completely clear yet whether they are actually terrorist attacks or simply personal violence. But
Correct.
in every case, though, they seem to um, uh, in, involve people who are strangers, who've come from outside. I think there's the problem of whether we call them migrants or refugees or some other term.
Hmm.
Uh, but it's becoming extremely important in Germany because it's putting Angela Merkel in a very difficult situation. And Francois Hollande in France, for that matter, has a
Yes.
similar problem. And
Yes.
it
Yes.
is difficult to understand why there has been so much of this type of activity in France over the last year or so, and that now seems to be so much in Germany. Anyway, the big question for us, of course, is does it have anything to do with globalization?
Hmm.
Or is it just the problem of mixing two different types of society without any planning, and the fact that in each society there are completely different expectations? And it's certainly true that European society, whether German or French or English, is organized very differently from any society that might come from the Middle East, and ordinary people have very different expectations, and so that makes it very difficult for a large number of people from the European countries and a large number of people from one of the Middle Eastern countries to live in the same community because they expect different things. Especially since if it has anything to do with sex and gender, that has always, since the beginning of human history, been the primary feature of social organization, which has only begun to be modified anywhere in the last 50 years or so, and now is totally different from between Europe and the Middle East, whereas 100 years ago it was basically the same. There are these problems. However, it seems to me that there's another problem, or at least there's another way of looking at it. And this is something which I find particularly interesting because I think that it relates to what I consider to be the most significant factor in globalization. I mean, all the literature on globalization talks about economics or politics or trade or something like that.
Right.
The sorts of things that most people are used to reading and have some idea how to analyze. And I think that the basic change that is causing everything to happen that we look on, and for want of a better term, called globalization, is in fact the way people interact with each other. It's social. It has to do with social interaction and the quality of social life. And that has changed over the last 50 years since I was growing up, since I was going to school and college, in ways that we don't have a vocabulary to talk about. Now, why is it changing? Well, in my opinion, and you've heard me say this before, the reason it's changing is that there are more of us.
Hmm.
So each of us is interacting with more people. And not only that, but even though the population in the 1950s, world population was just over 2 billion people, and now it's close to 8 billion people. So that's an incredible change in 50 years. And of course, most of the change is not immediately around us or immediately in Germany. Nevertheless, each of these countries is much larger in size than it was before. And it's interesting, by the way, that England, the rise in size of population in England has probably been less than in almost every other country in the world. It's only gone up from 58 million to 64 million between the 1950s or even the 60s and now.
That's not much.
And that's it would be nice to have some sense of exactly why that is the case, because and I can't offhand give comparable figures for France and Germany, but I'm sure that France and Germany have increased much more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, they've had very different histories. Anyway, what has been happening is that we're all interacting in much larger arenas than we were before. So 50 years ago, in the course of a day, one would interact with 20 people, sometimes more than that, but not that much more. And yes, you interact with writing, but you don't read that many letters a day, and you don't write that many letters a day. And long-distance telephone calls didn't become easy until the 1970s. And then, of course, in the 1990s, we started to have easy internet connection. So the size of the arena within which we interact with people has increased at an incredible rate over the last few decades. Now, that means that when we interacted with people 50 years ago, we recognized easily what their place in life was compared to ours. And we recognized them by the way they dressed, by the way they talked, and all sorts of other things. And it all had to do with occupation and education and wealth and so on. But we didn't really have much difficulty with that, and some people on the left complained about it, and other people on the right tried to increase it. So the quality of our social relationships has been diluted over the 50-year period, because we don't recognize people like that anymore, and we don't make so much distinction anymore between family relationships, friendly relationships, acquaintances, and so on. But I think there's something that's even more important than that, and that is that 50 years ago, everybody knew their place in society and knew what they would do with their lives. And most people didn't have the opportunity to work out from scratch what they wanted to do with their lives and go about making it possible. Society did things for them. People belonged to society. It was very important to have a place in society, and that solved your problems. And that doesn't happen anymore. And many people have very great difficulty working out how to fit into society over the lifespan. And psychology was invented 100 years ago. The number of people earning their living by psychology or psychiatry has been increasing exponentially ever since then. Mm-hmm. 50 years ago, we didn't know what depression was. Now it's normal to have a depression. Everybody is told to look out for it, told how to recognize it, what you should do about it. So many of the people who've been causing the violence recently appear to be people, A, who can't work out what to do with their lives, and B, exhibit the symptoms of depression. And in some cases, there are people who only very recently, but seem to have some connection with Islamic State, but only made that connection very recently. And Islamic State is something that tells them what to do with their lives when they're in a hopeless situation.
And the other thing it does is it addresses the issue of giving them a place in the social stratification, where they feel a little bit adrift and not knowing their place in society and feeling impotent because they can't reach upwards in the social scale. They're part of something larger that has a much higher place in the social scale.
So my wife, Leah, who started talking in these terms and gave me the ideas that I've just been talking about, talks about it in terms of selfhood,
Okay.
and the meaning of self. And I like to avoid that term because I feel that it puts the whole idea on the psychologist's table. And I don't think it's a psychological problem. I think it's a social problem. But psychologists are trained to be clinical and cure people's problems. Social scientists are not.
Well,
And I wish, yeah.
it is a social problem. I believe because of the reasons you outlined. It's because of the ability of anybody, whether they're well-adjusted or a misfit, to have a vast increase in the number of daily contacts and interactions that they have with many, many people. And if you are a young person, and if you are new to society or a society, or if simply you are young and do not have the requisite social experience, you can become frustrated if, for example, your views are not listened to by higher ups, whether they be governors of states or important people running companies. I mean, the social order existed for a reason, and sometimes this seems to be lost and can't be understood by people who are new to it.
So the question is, what do we do about it?
Well, there's only two ways that I can see: either get rid of the social order, or try to educate those who need to be educated about the social order.
No, well, let me put it in slightly different terms. That social order has to do with the size of the society, and as the size of the society increases, the social order has to adapt. National societies were very different, for example, and after all, we didn't really have national societies until the 19th century, different from the societies we had before that. The biggest problem in globalization is, I've thought for some time, is going to be that if we have a global society which becomes one community of 10 billion people, it's not going to be culturally homogeneous. And governments, there's going to be no governments controlling their borders, because we know they can't do it even now.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no idea how we're going to build some sort of social order that everybody will feel they understand in a society of 10 billion people. So I think this is the biggest problem of globalization. And because I think that a completely global society, when our species becomes a global community as well as a global species, is not going to be able to have a global government. Everything is going to have to be done by negotiation, and but just who's going to be negotiating for whom, we don't know.
And plus, Brian, negotiation is predicated on people being able to accept compromise.
The current Brexit negotiations are very interesting for this reason, because you've got a group of people, especially Merkel and May and Hollande, but to some extent all the other heads of government of the 28 European countries, with different interests, and of course they all speak English, actually trying to work out what their common ground is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the global problem on a small scale, and we're probably going to be able to learn a lot from it.
It could be a good litmus test.
Yeah. I think that the most important thing, and the first thing that I think I should do as a social scientist trying to be clinical, is to raise awareness of the problem and work out much better ways of helping people to understand the problem. Because at the moment, I think the problem simply is not understood.
I would agree with you. I think it would be a very profitable use of future broadcasts.
Okay.
All right, Brian. Thank you very much. We'll talk next week. All right.